Old veteran watches thugs bullying little girl on bus. He steps in and teaches them a painful lesson. Frank Winters never meant to be a hero again. Not at 73, with hands that trembled when he forgot his medication and knees that predicted rain better than any weatherman. The war had taken enough from him: sleep, peace of mind, and James. Especially James. The number 42 bus creaked to a stop at the corner of Maple and 5th, right on schedule at 3:15 p.m. Frank gripped his worn leather wallet, pulled out his senior transit pass, and climbed aboard with practiced caution. 3 steps up, nod to the driver, Pete today, not the usual Thursday guy, then 9 steps to his preferred seat. Middle of the bus, right side, facing forward. Old habits. Today marked 15 years since James died. 15 years since Frank had held his best friend's hand in a military hospital tent as the life drained from his eyes. James Callahan, the only man Frank had ever called brother despite sharing no blood. The only person who'd understood the darkness that lived inside Frank's head after their third tour. Frank unzipped his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. The edges were soft from years of handling, the colors faded to sepia tones. 2 young men in desert camo, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning despite the hell around them. 15 years, brother, he whispered. Still feels like yesterday. The memory came unbidden, as it always did on this anniversary. The ambush. The explosion. Frank dragging James behind a crumbling wall as gunfire rained around them. The look in James's eyes when they both realized the bleeding wouldn't stop. Promise me, Frank. James's voice had been surprisingly strong despite the blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. His hand had gripped Frank's with unexpected power. Promise you'll keep fighting for the ones who can't fight for themselves. Even when you're old and tired. Even when it seems easier to look away. Don't forget why we came here. I promise, Frank had said, the words choking him as he'd felt James's grip loosen. I swear it, brother. For 15 years, Frank had kept that promise in ways both small and large. He'd intervened when neighbors fought loudly enough to frighten their children. He'd stood up when a cashier was being berated by an angry customer. Small acts of courage that kept James's memory alive. But lately, as his body betrayed him more each day, doubt had crept in. Last month, he'd witnessed a man shove a woman during an argument on this very bus route, and he'd frozen. His mind had screamed at him to act, to intervene, but his body had refused to cooperate. By the time he'd finally stood up, the man had already exited at his stop, leaving the woman in tears. That night, James had appeared in his dreams for the first time in years. Not the dying James of the hospital tent, but the strong, vibrant James from their early days in the service. He hadn't spoken in the dream, just fixed Frank with that disappointed look he'd always used when Frank was making excuses. The memory of that failure burned like acid in Frank's chest as the bus rumbled forward. He tucked the photograph back into his pocket and stared out the window, watching the familiar landmarks of his neighborhood slide by. The pawn shop where he'd sold his service medals 5 years ago to help pay for his granddaughter's college textbooks. The diner where he ate breakfast every Sunday, alone but for the memories of his late wife, Margaret. The bus continued its route, stopping and starting in the rhythm that had become the heartbeat of Frank's carefully structured days. Thursday, today, was his standing appointment with Dr. Morris, the VA psychiatrist who still believed Frank could be reintegrated after all these years. Frank almost laughed at the thought. Reintegrated. As if the pieces of himself he'd left behind in the desert would somehow materialize and make him whole again. As the bus approached the hospital district, Frank's eyes drifted to his reflection in the window. Gray hair cut military short despite the decades since his discharge. Deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much. A jaw still set with the determination that had carried him through 3 tours and the loss of almost everyone he'd ever loved. You're a relic, Frank, he murmured to his reflection. A walking museum of a war everyone wants to forget. It was during that moment of distraction that the little girl boarded. Frank didn't notice her at first, his mind still tangled in memories of sand and blood and promises. But as the bus pulled away from the stop, Something about her caught his attention. Something in the way she clutched her backpack to her chest like a shield. Something in the wariness of her eyes as she scanned the half-emptied bus for a seat. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with unruly brown hair pulled into messy pigtails and a purple backpack adorned with cartoon characters Frank didn't recognize. She wore a yellow t-shirt that seemed too thin for the approaching autumn chill, and shoes with lights that flashed faintly with each step she took down the aisle. She chose a seat 3 rows ahead of Frank, across the aisle. Her feet barely touched the floor. Frank frowned. Where were her parents? What was a child so young doing on a city bus alone at this hour? The girl pulled a small book from her backpack and began to read, her shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. Frank recognized the posture. He'd seen it in civilians in war zones, in new recruits facing their first firefight. It was the body language of someone expecting trouble. As if summoned by his thoughts, the trouble arrived at the very next stop. 4 teenage boys boarded, laughing and shoving each other with the performative aggression of young men trying to prove their dominance. The oldest couldn't have been more than 17, with a patchy attempt at a beard and a swagger that poorly masked his insecurity. The others followed his lead, their eyes scanning the bus for entertainment or targets, in their world, often the same thing. Frank watched as their gaze fell on the little girl with the purple backpack. He saw the alpha nudge his friends, nodding in her direction. He saw the predatory smiles spread across their faces. And suddenly, Frank wasn't on a city bus in 2024 anymore. He was back in Iraq, watching a group of insurgents stalk toward a village of civilians who couldn't possibly defend themselves. He was in Afghanistan, arriving too late to stop an atrocity. He heard James's voice as clearly as if his friend were sitting beside him. "We fight for those who can't, Frank. That's what separates us from them." Frank's hands curled into fists on his knees as the teenagers made their way down the aisle, deliberately taking seats around the little girl. His appointment with Dr. Morris suddenly seemed very far away and utterly unimportant. "Looks like I might be late today, Doc," Frank whispered, his eyes never leaving the unfolding scene ahead of him. "Got an old promise to keep first." The 4 teenagers settled into the seats surrounding the little girl like wolves circling a lamb. The bus lurched forward, and no one else seemed to notice, or care, about what was unfolding. A businessman tapped away on his phone. An elderly woman dozed near the front. The driver kept his eyes on the road. Frank's jaw tightened as he observed the calculating looks the boys exchanged. The leader, the one with the patchy beard, sat directly across from the girl. He wore a red hoodie with the sleeves pushed up to reveal amateur tattoos that Frank guessed were gang-related. The others followed his silent commands with practiced precision. "Hey there, princess," Red Hoodie said, his voice carrying easily to Frank's seat. "That's a nice backpack. My little sister has one just like it." The girl didn't respond, keeping her eyes fixed on her book, though Frank noticed her knuckles whitening as she gripped it tighter. "I'm talking to you," Red Hoodie continued, his tone hardening slightly. "It's rude to ignore people. Please leave me alone," the girl whispered, her voice so small it was almost lost in the rumble of the bus engine. "I'm just trying to get home." One of the other boys, rail-thin with a shock of bleached hair, snickered. "She's just trying to get home," he mimicked in a high-pitched voice. "Aren't we all, sweetheart?" Red Hoodie leaned forward. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated before answering. "Lily." "Lily," Red Hoodie repeated, drawing out the syllables. "Like the flower. Pretty. I'm Damon. These are my friends, Tyler, Marcus, and Kev." Frank shifted in his seat, his muscles tensing in preparation. He'd seen this routine before, the false friendliness before the strike. It was how predators operated, lulling their prey into a false sense of security. "What grade are you in, Lily?" Damon asked, his expression a parody of interest. "Fifth," Lily answered, glancing around as if searching for help. Her eyes briefly met Frank's before darting away. "Fifth grade," Damon nodded. "So that makes you what, 10? 11? 10, Lily confirmed, closing her book and clutching it to her chest alongside her backpack. The skinny boy, Tyler, reached across the aisle and tugged at one of Lily's pigtails. 10 years old and riding the bus all by herself. Where's your mommy, little girl? Lily flinched away from his touch. My mom works. I'm supposed to take the bus to my grandma's house after school. Your mom works. Marcus, a heavy-set boy with a shaved head, repeated with a smirk. Doing what? Dancing at the club on 5th? The fourth boy, Kev, laughed too loudly. He wore a black beanie pulled low over his eyes, which darted nervously around the bus. Frank pegged him as the lookout. Lily's cheeks flushed red. My mom's a nurse at Memorial Hospital. She helps people. Damon smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. A nurse, huh? That's cool. So what you got in that backpack, Nurse Lily's daughter? Anything good? Frank watched as Lily hugged her backpack tighter. Just school stuff. Just school stuff, Damon echoed. Mind if I see? I'm really interested in school stuff. No, Lily said, her voice suddenly stronger. It's mine. A flash of annoyance crossed Damon's face before he masked it with another smile. Come on, don't be like that. We're just being friendly. I don't think she wants to be friends, Frank said, his voice cutting through the tension. All 5 heads turned in his direction, as if noticing him for the first time. Frank hadn't planned to speak yet. He'd been assessing the situation, calculating odds and angles as he'd been trained to do. But something in the girl's defiant "no" had reminded him so strongly of his granddaughter that the words had slipped out before he could stop them. Damon's eyes narrowed as they swept over Frank, taking in his weathered face, his military short gray hair, the faded jacket with no insignia. This doesn't concern you, old man. Frank held his gaze steadily. I think it does. The bus slowed for a stop, and several passengers disembarked. No one new got on. Frank noted that they were now in a rougher part of town, where the buildings were more dilapidated and many storefronts were boarded up. Fewer witnesses now. No coincidence, he suspected. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Damon turned his attention back to Lily. So anyway, about that backpack. He reached across the aisle and grabbed the strap of Lily's purple backpack, giving it a sharp tug. Lily yelped in surprise, trying to maintain her grip. Let go! She cried, louder this time. Just want to see what's inside. Damon insisted, pulling harder. The other boys closed ranks. Tyler moved to the seat beside Lily, effectively blocking her from escaping into the aisle. Marcus stood up, ostensibly to adjust his pants but actually positioning himself to obscure the view from the front of the bus. Kev kept his eyes on Frank, his hands slipping into his pocket. Something cold settled in Frank's chest, a familiar calm that had served him well in combat. Time seemed to slow as his mind rapidly assessed the situation. 4 against 1. Bad odds for most people. But Frank wasn't most people. The boys were young, strong, and possibly armed. But they were also undisciplined, overconfident, and untrained. Frank had survived 3 tours in hell because he knew how to read threats, calculate risks, and act decisively when necessary. More importantly, he knew what was at stake. Not just Lily's safety, but his promise to James. A promise that had kept him going when everything else in his life had crumbled away. We fight for those who can't, Frank. Lily let out another cry as Damon gave a vicious tug on her backpack. A zipper tore, and several books spilled onto the floor. Stop it! Lily pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. Please! No one on the bus moved to help her. The businessman had put in earbuds. The elderly woman was still sleeping. The driver, separated by a plastic partition, remained oblivious. Frank stood up. Looks like some people need a lesson in respect, he murmured, his voice lost beneath the rumble of the bus engine. He took a step forward, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt no pain in his knees. Frank moved down the aisle with deliberate steps, each footfall landing with quiet precision. The bus swayed and rattled over potholes, but Frank maintained his balance effortlessly, as if his body had suddenly remembered skills long dormant. He stopped beside Lily's seat, positioning himself between her and Damon. That's enough, Frank said, his voice low but carrying a weight that made Damon's smirk falter. The teenager recovered quickly, leaning back in his seat with exaggerated casualness. What's it to you, Grandpa? We're just having a friendly conversation with Lily here. Doesn't look friendly to me, Frank replied, glancing down at the torn backpack and scattered books. His eyes met Lily's, and he gave her a slight nod of reassurance. Tyler snickered. Maybe you need glasses, old man. We're just playing around. Frank turned his attention to Tyler, fixing him with a stare that made the boy's laughter die in his throat. Pick those books up. What? Tyler blinked, clearly not expecting the command. Her books. Pick them up. Tyler looked to Damon for guidance, his previous bravado evaporating under Frank's unwavering gaze. Damon stood up slowly, using his height advantage to tower over Frank. At 17, he was already 6'1" and still growing. Frank, in contrast, stood at 5'10", and the years had taken away an inch or two from his former military posture. Look, I don't know who you think you are, Damon said, lowering his voice to sound menacing. But you should mind your own business before you get hurt. There's 4 of us and 1 of you. The other passengers on the bus were now watching the confrontation with wary interest, but no one made a move to help. The driver glanced in his rearview mirror but kept driving. I know exactly who I am, Frank replied calmly. The question is, do you know who you are? Because right now, you're a bully picking on a child. Is that really who you want to be? Something flickered across Damon's face, a moment of uncertainty, before his expression hardened again. Nice speech, old-timer. Now step aside before things get ugly. Frank didn't move. Things already got ugly when you decided to terrorize this girl. Kev stood up now, moving to Damon's side. Damon, we should just go. This isn't worth it. Shut up, Damon snapped without taking his eyes off Frank. We're not going anywhere. Frank observed the dynamics with interest. Kev was afraid, not of Frank necessarily, but of escalation. He was the cautious one of the group, the one who calculated risks. Useful information. Last warning, Frank said, his tone making it clear he wouldn't repeat himself. Apologize to the girl, give back her things, and find somewhere else to sit. Damon laughed, looking around at his friends for approval. Or what? You'll hit me with your walker? Call a nurse? Tell my mommy? Frank didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but a knowing one that seemed to catch Damon off guard. You've got a lot to learn about judging threats, son, Frank said quietly. Something in his tone made Marcus take an involuntary step back. Even Tyler looked uncertain now. But Damon was committed to his path, too deep into the confrontation to back down without losing face. I'm not your son, Damon growled. And you're nothing but a washed-up old man who should mind his own business. Lily's voice suddenly broke through the tension. Please, just leave me alone. All of you. Frank glanced at her tear-streaked face and felt a surge of protective anger. This girl reminded him not just of his granddaughter, but of all the innocent civilians he'd sworn to protect during his service, people caught in the crossfire of others' aggression and cruelty. It's okay, Lily, Frank assured her. I'm not leaving you alone with them. Damon made a dismissive sound. How touching. The old soldier playing hero. He reached out suddenly and shoved Frank's shoulder. I said move. Frank didn't budge an inch, absorbing the push as if it were nothing. His eyes, however, changed, hardening into something dangerous that made even Damon hesitate. Don't do that again, Frank warned, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. The bus lurched to another stop. The doors opened, but no one got on or off. They were in the industrial district now, with fewer witnesses around. The perfect place for things to go badly. Or what? Damon challenged, doubling down despite the warning signs. What are you gonna do, tough guy? Frank took a deep breath, centering himself. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of a man who had given orders in combat, a voice that expected to be obeyed. I spent 22 years in Special Forces, Frank said evenly. I've fought in conflicts you've only seen in video games. I've neutralized threats more dangerous than you before my morning coffee. So when I tell you to back off, it's not a suggestion, it's me trying to save you from what happens next. The bus fell completely silent. Even the elderly woman who had been dozing was awake now, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. For a moment, Frank thought his words had gotten through. Kev was already backing away, clearly wanting no part of what might follow. Marcus looked uncertain, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Even Tyler's cocky smile had faded. But Damon wasn't ready to surrender. His pride was on the line now, his authority among his friends at stake. He leaned in close to Frank's face. You don't scare me, old man. I don't care what you did 20 years ago. This is now, and you're just a relic who should be in a nursing home. Frank didn't flinch at the proximity. Last chance, son. Walk away. Damon's response was to reach past Frank toward Lily. I think I'll take that backpack now. Frank moved. It wasn't a wild swing or an aggressive lunge. It was a precise, economical movement, the kind that comes from years of training and real-world application. One moment, Damon's hand was reaching for the backpack. The next, his wrist was caught in Frank's iron grip. Wrong choice, Frank said softly. The real battle was about to begin. Time slowed to a crawl as Frank held Damon's wrist. In that fraction of a second, everything changed. The bus, the passengers, the city beyond the windows, all of it faded to background noise as Frank's combat instincts surged to the surface after years of dormancy. Shock registered on Damon's face, quickly replaced by anger. The boy yanked his arm back and swung wildly with his other hand, aiming a punch at Frank's head. Frank didn't block the punch. He wasn't there when it arrived. With a pivot that defied his 73 years, Frank sidestepped the blow and used Damon's momentum against him, guiding the teenager forward into an empty seat. Before Damon could recover, Frank had the boy's arm twisted behind his back in a control hold that sent pain shooting up to his shoulder without causing permanent damage, a technique perfected in countless real-world situations. Stay down, Frank advised softly, applying just enough pressure to make his point. Tyler launched himself at Frank with a snarl, but his telegraphed attack might as well have been announced with flashing lights. Frank released Damon with a shove that pinned him temporarily against the window, then turned to meet the new threat. As Tyler charged, Frank stepped into the attack rather than away from it, disrupting the boy's balance with a simple redirection of force. Tyler stumbled, off balance and vulnerable. A precise strike to his solar plexus, not hard enough to cause serious harm, but sufficient to empty his lungs of air, left him gasping on the floor of the bus. 2 down, Frank muttered. Marcus hesitated, clearly reassessing the situation. This wasn't going according to plan. The old man wasn't an easy target. He was something else entirely. Marcus was the largest of the four, relying on his bulk to intimidate. He lunged forward, trying to use his weight advantage. Frank didn't resist the force. Instead, he guided it, turning slightly to let Marcus's momentum carry him forward while using the teenager's own arm as a lever. In one fluid motion, he directed Marcus face first into a metal support pole. The impact wasn't severe, but it was enough to disorient the boy, who slumped to his knees, holding his forehead. That's 3, Frank said, his breathing still calm and measured. The entire sequence had taken less than 10 seconds. Several passengers gasped. Someone toward the front of the bus shouted, "Driver! Stop the bus!" The vehicle began to slow, but they were on a stretch of road with no immediate place to pull over. Frank turned his attention to Kev, the only one of the four still standing. The boy had backed up against the rear door of the bus, his hand still in his pocket. "Don't," Frank warned, recognizing the posture of someone reaching for a weapon. Kev's eyes darted between Frank and his friends, who were all in various states of disarray but beginning to recover. His hand slowly emerged from his pocket, clutching not a knife as Frank had feared, but a small canister of pepper spray. "I don't want to use this, man," Kev said, his voice wavering. "Then don't," Frank replied calmly, keeping his distance. Put it away and walk away. This doesn't have to continue. For a moment, it seemed like Kev might take the offer. Then Damon's voice cut through the tension. Use it, you coward! Spray the old bastard! Kev hesitated, his loyalty to his friends warring with his instinct for self-preservation. Frank watched the internal struggle play out on the boy's face. Listen to me, Frank said quietly. You don't want to do this. You're smarter than that. Behind them, Damon had recovered enough to stand up, rage distorting his features. You're dead, old man. Frank sensed the movement before he saw it. He pivoted smoothly, catching Damon's wrist mid-swing and using the boy's own momentum to slam him face first into the side of the bus. The impact was controlled but firm enough to split Damon's lip against the metal frame. Stay down this time, Frank advised, his voice tinged with disappointment rather than anger. Tyler was breathing again, struggling to his feet with hatred in his eyes. But before he could rejoin the fight, the unmistakable sound of a switchblade opening cut through the chaos. Marcus had pulled a knife. The bus collectively held its breath. The situation had escalated beyond bullying to genuine danger. Put it away, son, Frank said, his voice taking on a different quality now, harder, more commanding. You don't want to add this to whatever charges you're already facing. Shut up, Marcus shouted, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. Nobody makes us look stupid. He lunged forward, slashing wildly with the knife. Frank moved with mechanical precision, catching Marcus's wrist and applying pressure to a nerve cluster that sent shock waves of pain up the boy's arm. The knife clattered to the floor. In one continuous motion, Frank spun Marcus around and locked him in a restrained hold that immobilized both arms. It's over, Frank said firmly. But it wasn't. Kev, seeing his friends defeated one by one, finally made his choice. He raised the pepper spray and aimed it at Frank's face. Frank saw it coming. With Marcus still secured in his hold, he had limited options. He turned his head away and closed his eyes at the last moment, but not before seeing something unexpected, Lily rising from her seat with determination on her tear-streaked face. No! She screamed, and shoved Kev's arm upward just as he pressed the nozzle. The spray discharged harmlessly toward the ceiling of the bus, causing several passengers to cough and cover their faces, but missing its intended target. In the confusion, Kev lost his grip on the canister. It rolled under a seat. The bus finally pulled over to the curb, its doors opening with a hydraulic hiss. The driver stood up, a heavy flashlight in hand. Police are on their way, he shouted. Everybody stay where you are. Damon, blood dripping from his split lip, looked at his friends, one wheezing on the floor, one immobilized in Frank's grip, one backed against the rear door, and finally seemed to understand the situation. We're done, he said, raising his hands in surrender. We're done. Frank released Marcus carefully, keeping himself positioned between the boys and Lily. The battlefield that had awakened within him began to quiet, but remained vigilant. The war might be over, but the mission wasn't complete yet. Blue and red lights flashed through the bus windows as two police cruisers pulled up alongside the stopped vehicle. The passengers had separated themselves into distinct groups, most huddled near the front, while Frank, Lily, and the 4 teenagers remained in the rear section. Damon sat slumped in a seat, a handkerchief pressed to his split lip. Tyler had recovered enough to breathe normally but remained seated on the floor, knees drawn to his chest. Marcus stood with his back against the window, rubbing his wrist where Frank had restrained him. Kev hovered uncertainly by the rear door, looking like he might bolt if given the opportunity. Frank had positioned himself next to Lily, who was quietly collecting her scattered books and placing them back into her torn backpack. Are you okay? Frank asked her softly. She nodded, wiping the last traces of tears from her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered. Then, with a hint of wonder in her voice, she added, That was amazing. How did you do all that? Frank smiled slightly. Practice. Lots of practice. The bus doors opened, and 2 officers boarded, hands resting cautiously on their holstered weapons as they surveyed the scene. The bus driver immediately approached them, gesturing animatedly toward the back of the bus. "Officers, I want to press charges," Damon called out, his voice thick through his swollen lip. "This old man harassed us for no reason." Several passengers immediately protested, their voices overlapping in defense of Frank. "That's not what happened. Those boys were bullying that little girl. The old gentleman was protecting her." The officers raised their hands for quiet. The first officer, a stocky man with a sergeant's stripes, moved down the aisle while his partner stayed near the front, taking initial statements from the driver and nearby passengers. "I'm Sergeant Peterson," the officer said as he reached them. "I need everyone to stay calm while we sort this out." His experienced eyes took in the scene: the teenagers' disheveled appearances, the girl's torn backpack, the elderly man standing protectively beside her. "Who wants to tell me what happened here?" Before anyone else could speak, Frank stepped forward. "My name is Frank Winters, Sergeant. Former Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army Special Forces." He gestured toward the teenagers. "These young men were harassing this child. When I asked them to stop, they became aggressive. I defended myself and the girl." Sergeant Peterson nodded slowly. "I see. And the knife?" Frank pointed to where the switchblade still lay on the floor of the bus. "That belongs to him," he said, indicating Marcus. "He pulled it during the altercation." Marcus paled. "That's not true. It's not mine." "Check it for fingerprints," Frank suggested calmly. "And there's pepper spray under that seat that belongs to him." He nodded toward Kev, who looked away guiltily. The sergeant's expression hardened as he took in this information. He spoke into his shoulder radio, requesting an evidence team. "Sir?" Lily suddenly spoke up, her voice stronger than before. "These boys were trying to take my backpack. They were pushing me and making fun of me. That man," she pointed to Frank, "was the only one who helped me." Sergeant Peterson knelt to bring himself to Lily's eye level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lily Chin." "Lily, how old are you?" 10. "I'm supposed to take this bus to my grandma's house after school. My mom's a nurse, and she works late on Thursdays." The sergeant nodded, his expression softening slightly. "We'll need to call your mom or grandma to come get you, okay?" Lily nodded, clutching her repacked backpack to her chest. The sergeant stood and turned to Frank. "Mr. Winters, I'll need a full statement from you as well. These boys claim you harassed them without provocation." Frank nodded calmly. "I understand. But before we get to that, I'd like a word with them." He gestured toward the 4 teenagers. "Just 1 minute." Sergeant Peterson hesitated, then nodded. "Make it quick." Frank approached the 4 boys, who eyed him warily. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only they could hear him. "Today could have gone very differently," he began, his tone neither threatening nor angry, just matter-of-fact. "I could have broken bones. I could have done permanent damage. I didn't, because unlike you, I understand the difference between force and violence." He looked each of them in the eye, one by one. "This is your wake-up call. The path you're on leads to one of 2 places, prison or the cemetery. I've seen it too many times to count." He turned to Damon specifically. "You, in particular, have a choice to make. You're their leader. They follow your example. Right now, you're leading them straight to destruction." Damon tried to maintain his defiant glare, but something in Frank's unwavering gaze made it impossible. "Whatever brought you to this point, whatever pain or anger or emptiness you're carrying, this isn't the answer," Frank continued. "Trust me. I know something about pain." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, worn card. He handed it to Damon. "This is the contact information for a program at the VA. It's for troubled youth. They'll help you find a better path, if you want it." Damon stared at the card, genuine confusion replacing his anger. "Why would you help us? After what we did?" Frank's expression softened slightly. "Because someone once helped me, when I was heading down a dark road. And because everyone deserves a second chance." He paused. "But only one. This is yours. Don't waste it." The color seemed to drain from Damon's face as Frank's words sank in. For the first time, the teenager seemed to see past his own rage and recognize the gravity of what had transpired, and how close he'd come to a much worse outcome. "What did you mean about prison or cemetery?" Tyler asked, his voice barely audible. Frank turned to him. "The knife your friend pulled? That's a felony. Another few years of this behavior, and you'll be facing real time in a real prison. Or you'll threaten the wrong person, someone without my restraint, and you'll end up finished." The stark reality of his words hung in the air between them. "The choice is yours," Frank said finally. "Make a better one than you did today." 2 hours later, Frank sat on a bench outside the police station, watching the evening traffic pass by. The statement-taking had been thorough but straightforward. Multiple witnesses had corroborated his account, and the evidence, the knife, the pepper spray, Lily's torn backpack, told its own story. The teenagers had been taken into custody, their parents called. Frank had declined to press charges, asking instead that the boys be directed to community service and the youth program he'd mentioned. A small figure approached, accompanied by a woman in hospital scrubs. Lily and her mother. They stopped in front of Frank, and Mrs. Chen extended her hand. "Mr. Winters," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you for protecting my daughter." Frank stood and shook her hand. "No thanks necessary, ma'am." Mrs. Chen shook her head. "The officer told me what those boys had with them, a knife, pepper spray. If you hadn't been there." She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "But I was," Frank said simply. Lily stepped forward and, to Frank's surprise, hugged him tightly around the waist. "Thank you," she whispered. Something warm bloomed in Frank's chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He patted her shoulder awkwardly, unused to such displays of affection. "You were pretty brave yourself," he told her. "Not everyone would have had the courage to help the way you did, knocking that spray away." Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide. "I wasn't brave. I was scared." Frank smiled. "That's what bravery is, Lily. Being scared but doing what's right anyway." Mrs. Chen touched her daughter's shoulder. "We should go, honey. Grandma's waiting." She looked at Frank again. Would you join us for dinner sometime, Mr. Winters? It would mean a lot to us." Frank hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad, writing down his phone number. "Call me anytime." As they walked away, Lily turned back and waved. Frank waved in return, watching until they disappeared around the corner. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Frank checked his watch, 7:45 p.m. He'd missed his appointment with Dr. Morris by hours. Strangely, he didn't feel the usual guilt that accompanied such lapses in his routine. Instead, he felt lighter. Frank made his way to the bus stop. The ride home would be long, but he didn't mind. His body ached from the exertion of the day's events, a reminder that despite the muscle memory that had served him well, he was still 73 years old. Yet the pain felt different somehow. Purposeful. As the bus approached, Frank fished in his pocket for his transit pass. His fingers brushed against the photograph of him and James. He pulled it out, studying his friend's youthful face in the fading light. "I kept our promise today, brother," he whispered. The bus doors opened, and Frank climbed aboard. The driver, not Pete this time, but a younger man, nodded in greeting. Frank made his way to his usual seat, middle of the bus, right side, facing forward. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Frank glanced at the window beside him. For a moment, just a fleeting instant, he thought he saw a reflection that wasn't his own. James, young and strong, in his desert fatigues, sitting beside him with that crooked smile Frank remembered so well. "Not bad for an old-timer," the reflection seemed to say. "Still fighting the good fight." Frank smiled, not questioning the vision. "Someone has to." The reflection nodded, then faded as the bus passed under a streetlight, leaving only Frank's weathered face looking back at him. But the sense of James's presence lingered, more comforting than haunting. Frank's cell phone rang, startling him. The display showed Dr. Morris's office. He answered, expecting a reprimand for missing his appointment. "Mr. Winters," Dr. Morris's voice came through the speaker. "The police called to explain why you missed our session. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Doc," Frank replied, surprised to find he meant it. "Better than fine, actually. What you did today was remarkable," Dr. Morris said. "But also potentially triggering, given your history. Would you like to come in tomorrow instead?" Frank thought about it, looking out at the city lights beginning to flicker on as dusk deepened. "I don't think that'll be necessary, document." "No? May I ask why?" "Because for the first time in 15 years, I don't have nightmares about being too late, about not being able to help when it matters. Today, I was there when someone needed me. I kept my promise." There was a pause on the other end. Then Dr. Morris said, "That's a significant breakthrough, Frank. Are you sure you don't want to discuss it?" "I'm sure," Frank replied. "But I'll see you next Thursday as usual." After ending the call, Frank settled back in his seat, feeling the gentle sway of the bus. The city rolled by outside, full of people living their lives, some helping others, some causing harm, most just trying to get through another day. For decades, Frank had felt disconnected from that world, a ghost drifting through spaces he no longer belonged in. Today, he felt solid again. Real. Present. At the next stop, a teenager boarded, not one of the four from earlier, just an ordinary kid with headphones and a skateboard. He took a seat near Frank, nodding a casual greeting. Frank nodded back, no longer invisible. The bus continued into the night, carrying an old soldier who had discovered that some battles were still worth fighting, some promises worth keeping, no matter how many years had passed. And somewhere, Frank was certain, James was smiling.